Joining us tonight to take all of this up, the Vice President of the United States, Vice President Mike Pence, who tonight joins us from Guilford, New Hampshire. And Mr. Vice President, first, welcome. And I'd like to begin with what we were talking about, the Supreme Court nomination. How do you feel upon learning that the Senate Majority Leader has the votes to confirm the choice by the President, whomever she may be?
Well, let me first say we just are so grateful that Republicans in the Senate, almost all of them, have stepped forward and recognized that the President of the United States has a duty under the Constitution to appoint what the Constitution describes as judges to the Supreme Court. And this coming Saturday, after we properly honor the life and public service of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, President Donald Trump will announce a woman who will be the next great principled conservative on the Supreme Court. And as we said here in New Hampshire today, we're going to fill that seat.
Well, Mr. Vice President, you talk about honoring, as you are, as the President has insisted, honoring the service of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Are the Democrats not sullying her legacy as they have been making outrageous threats surrounding the Majority Leader's house with protesters and demonstrators, carrying out some of the most ugly, vicious threats that one can imagine, from packing the court to street violence? What do you think?
Well, I think you make a great point, because one of the aspects of Justice Ginsburg's career was her civility. She was very close to the late Justice Antonin Scalia, and history records that they agreed on very little in terms of judicial philosophy, Lou, but they were friends. Their families were friends. Our Labor Secretary wrote about that just a few short days ago. But look, I mean, we know that Joe Biden and the Democratic Party have been overtaken by the radical left, and the outrage that we're seeing, the absurd assertions. I mean, literally, you've heard leaders in the Democratic Party, from Nancy Pelosi on down, talking about impeaching the president or our attorney general to slow the process down. And just south of here in New Hampshire, we saw one prominent Democrat say in a tweet, he said, if the president fills the seat in 2020, we pack the court in 2021. Look, the American people are tired of it. They know this is a time when we all ought to be focused on honoring the life and service of Justice Ginsburg. And I think the vast majority of the American people outside the radical left understand the responsibility the president has. In fact, President Trump really believes it's an obligation to appoint a new justice to the Supreme Court. And Lou, history records, despite all of their objections, that there have been 29 vacancies on the Supreme Court of the United States since the founding of the Republic. And from George Washington all the way through Barack Obama, American presidents have made 29 appointments in those 29 vacancies during election years. So President Trump is going to do his duty. And with the news from Capitol Hill today of the support of Republicans in the Senate, almost all of them, we have every confidence that when the president unveils the remarkable woman and jurist that he will announce this coming Saturday, that we're going to fill that seat and we're going to add one more principled conservative to the Supreme Court of the United States.
I'd like to get your reaction to 2 points of view. One, Senator Ted Cruz, who I think put out a cogent and absolutely correct historical statement about the urgency of moving ahead before the election with this nomination and vote because of the atmosphere, the highly charged partisan divide that grips this country right now, and the view of apparently the Senate Majority Leader that he is not yet ready to say he wants to move this to a vote before the election, the inference being that he wants some sort of leverage for those senators who are in very tight races in which he apparently has made a judgment that would be helpful to them. I'd like to get your view on that because you're the man who will be deciding if there is a tie at any point in whatever is to be voted on in the Senate on SCOTUS and any other issue in this highly charged atmosphere.
Well, look, Lou, the president has a duty under Article 2 of the Constitution to appoint a new justice to the Supreme Court. But we respect the role of the Senate to advise and consent. But look, President Trump truly believes that the Senate should move thoroughly, thoughtfully, and quickly, and move to consideration, a hearing, if needs be, and ultimately to a floor vote. Because we have major issues in the country today, and Lou, with all of the talk about universal unsolicited mail-in balloting, where we see states around the country that are now extending the deadline, there is a possibility that election issues may come before the Supreme Court in the days following the election, and all the more reason why we should have 9 justices on the Supreme Court to be able to resolve any issues that may arise then or on any other matter. So the American people expect us to do our job. President Trump, I know, is going through a process of evaluating potential nominees as we speak. The president will make that decision. He'll make the announcement of the woman that he'll be nominating to the Supreme Court, and we're just going to continue to work closely with Republicans in the Senate and maybe a Democrat or two that might see their way clear, as a few have in the past, to support the president's nominee to the Supreme Court of the United States. But we believe we should move thoughtfully, thoroughly, and quickly, and move to a vote on the floor of the Senate.
The strong case that you make is that 9th justice certainly may be needed, given all that is happening with the mailing, with the distribution of 80 million ballots already out to people who did not solicit them or ask for them, and for which there is no safeguard for the integrity of our election. The Postal Service, as Nancy Pelosi referred to it as Election Central, is a frightening prospect since it's not even postal central right now, capable of carrying out its responsibilities to deliver mail expeditiously and on time. To introduce an election to put in the hands of the Postal Service seems to some of us to be utter madness.
Well, Lou, but let's be very clear to all of your viewers. Absentee balloting and voting is a time-honored tradition in this country. That's where an American will request a ballot, there's signature verification, and we fully support absentee voting. But what you see states around the country doing is authorizing universal mail-in voting, where they're literally mailing ballots to everybody on the list unsolicited. And then in many of those same states, they're authorizing what's called vote harvesting that would allow people to go and literally collect ballots. And it just creates a tremendous opportunity for fraud. It's one of the reasons why we've headed to courthouses around the country to challenge what we think would be a real threat to the basic integrity of the vote. And remember, that one person, one vote principle is at the very heart of our democracy. And the president and I are going to stand for that. We're going to stand for vote integrity. But in the event that that there are issues and controversies that arise in our courts that go to the Supreme Court, it's just one more reason why the president is moving so deliberately in making a decision about who he will nominate to the Supreme Court, and why we're going to continue to urge members of the United States Senate to move forward quickly, to advise and consent, and to vote to fill that seat on the Supreme Court of the United States.
And that one person, one vote principle at the bedrock of democracy means a person who is registered to vote and not a phantom vote based on the harvesting of votes by either party. As we wrap up here, Mr. Vice President, your thoughts about where the ticket stands in this campaign for re-election? How do you feel about it? And what are the polls telling you?
Well, I have to tell you, I'm in New Hampshire today, and the enthusiasm is greater here than it was in 2016, Lou. And I see that all over the country. I mean, and really, if you remember, 2016, it was about promises made. 2020 is about promises kept. I mean, as we talked in New Hampshire today, this is a president who said he'd rebuild our military, revive our economy through tax cuts, rolling back regulation, fighting for fair trade that you've been such a voice for so many years on the airwaves. We've stood up for our values and our constitutional liberties. And in our first 3 years, President Trump delivered on every promise he made to the American people, and he's led our nation through the challenging time of this year. And we literally are on track to have the first coronavirus vaccine available anywhere in the world before the end of this year. And while today we pass a heartbreaking milestone, and our hearts are with all of the families that have lost loved ones in the midst of this pandemic, I'm absolutely convinced, as the leader of the White House Coronavirus Task Force, that because of President Trump's early action, suspending all travel from China, launching the greatest national mobilization since World War II, reinventing testing, seeing to the delivery and the manufacture of hundreds of millions of supplies, and driving toward developing medicines and vaccines, I'm absolutely convinced that despite the heartbreaking losses that we've experienced, that we as Americans with this president have literally saved hundreds of thousands of American lives. And so it's been about the president's leadership. It's been about promises kept. And we came close in New Hampshire in 2016. But I believe with all my heart that New Hampshire and America are going to vote for 4 more years of President Donald Trump in the White House on November the 3rd.
Well, that's quite a ticket, Mr. Vice President. The Trump-Pence ticket has done pretty well. It'll be interesting to see November 3rd. We appreciate it. Thanks so much.